Okay. Oh, so I started speaking Hebrew before. Right? I apologize for the lateness. Apparently, our infrastructure is still not set up to handle rain. If ever, right? I always say that when it rains and the electricity goes out, they say they put a person on the moon like 60 years ago, right? But they can't have electricity when it rains. So the teretz is that it's not the same people. What? It also doesn't rain on the moon. Thank goodness. Right. Okay. The Seder. I have some additional sources. I didn't know how many people are here. I see many more than I expected. So I made like 20 copies of an additional source. I could look on together. We'll see if I get to it. So first, it's good to be back. A lot of familiar faces, new faces also. What? Look the same. Hopefully, we look the same, more or less. So what I would like to talk about is let's say the complex nature of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Because if we're used to to reading the story, and if we're say impacted by Hollywood, for example, if you remember the Ten Commandments, the first one, not the Prince of Egypt, but the Ten Commandments of Charlton Heston, Bnei Israel leave Egypt so with a lot of self-confidence, under firm leadership, and they're not really looking back. There isn't really attention paid to in a movie made in the late 1950s to the internal struggles and conflicts that might have been going on at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So I would like to look at that and see what we could learn from that for today. Most of our discussion will be looking at the Psukim and looking at some Hasidic masters, mostly the Meir Shiloach, the Sfat Emet, and Rabbi Tzadok Komi Lublin. I'd like to start with the first pasuk on the source sheet here. Vayechazek Hashem et leiv Paro melech Mitzrayim, vayirdof achrei bnei Yisrael, ubnei Yisrael yotzim biyad ramah. So there's a description of Bnei Israel. In what state of mind are they leaving? Bnei Israel yotzim biyad ramah. So what does biyad ramah mean literally? Right, we know from the Haggadah. Right, chas v'chalila. Okay, chas v'chalila. It's not even a joke. Okay. I'd rather not be nosei shem hatuma lashav. Okay. So with an upraised hand, with power, right? That like the emoji, like this, not the other thing, but like this when you're strong, right? With an upraised hand. I want to take a look at two targums and see what they say, and then explore what the difference might mean. Okay, the first targum is Miyuchas the Targum Yonatan. So Bnei Yisrael, it's a second source. Nafkim biyada miramima. Right, Bnei Yisrael yotzim biyad ramah. Right, that's just a good Aramaic translation. Biyad ramah, biyada miramima, with a raised hand. Mitgabrim al Mitzray. Right, overcoming the Egyptians. Okay, so that's one. Yad Ramah means Yad Ramah, an upraised hand, and the upraised hand is facing the Egyptians, right? Mitgabrin al Mitzray, right, to overcoming the Egyptians. Onkelos, next targum, v'takif Yashem yat liba de paro malka de Mitzrayim, right? God made Paro's heart hard. V'radaf batar b'nei Yisrael, and he ran after the children of Israel. U'b'nei Yisrael nafkin b'reish gali, and b'nei Yisrael are leaving with a head held high. Reish gali, an uncovered head, right? The head held high. So it's very interesting. What makes the Onkelos change it from Yad Ramah to Reish Gali? And what's the difference between Yad Ramah and Reish Gali? So I want to put that aside, right? Let's just put that aside. And now I want to, I'd like to explore, let's say, the complex nature of Bnei Yisrael's mindset at Yetziat Mitzrayim. Okay, so let's take a look here. The last source on the first side was Vayomer Moshe Lama Harei Ota. Everybody see that? Yeah? Okay, if when I'm reading the Hebrew, if you need a translation to English, if I'm overlooking that, so please stop me. I can do that, okay? So this is in the end of Parshat Shmot, when, let's just go back there for a second, when Moshe comes to Paro and asks Paro to release the people, so it actually makes things worse, right? So that's always bad for the Jews, right? So Moshe then complains to God, Lama Harei Ota, Lama Zeh Shlachtani. Right? So it seems that Moshe is loves the people, he cares for the people, and he wants to be faithful to God's mission, but it made things worse, and he doesn't understand that. Okay? So now the Meir Shilach says as follows. Okay? Hine, you see the last source on the first side, yeah? Right, the bottom. Okay? Hine lefi ha'reut, what it seems, right? Hu pele, ech yatsa mipi Moshe davar kazeh neged Hashem yitbarach. How could Moshe speak that way to God? Right? Lama harayot lama zeh shlachtani. Remember, Moshe didn't want to do the job in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like saying, I told you so to God, right? There's a lot of chutzpah, right? So it's a pele, how could Moshe speak that way against God? Ach be'emet, in truth, Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom haya ohev Yisrael. Right? Moshe was motivated by his love of Israel. The kasher shama mipi hagvura, and when he heard, this is according to Midrash, ki yitztachu liot od b'Mitzrayim ad achar hamarkot she'avu Mitzrayim. So when he understood that Bnei Yisrael were not going to, the Paro wasn't going to release the people right away, that he wasn't going to come to Egypt, say release them, and Paro say is going to be suddenly overcome by this, spirit of reason and beneficence, right, that he's going to let the people go. So it's going to be a struggle, and it's going to take time, and there's going to have to be Eser Makot, right? That's going to take, according to Chazal, it took about a year, right? So when Moshe Rabbeinu understood that it wasn't going to be a walk, a Shabbos afternoon walk out of Egypt, right? The kasher, right, shamami pi hagvura, when he heard from God, ki yitztarchu liot od b'Mitzrayim ad achar hamakot she'avru Mitzrayim, until after the makot that Mitzrayim would have to suffer. Az sha'al, then he asked, halo biyadcha berega echad lefdot et Yisrael. You can save Israel in a moment. Right? V'lama yiyu b'Mitzrayim yud beit chodesh lirot hamakot sheyifchedu mipneihem. Now this is interesting. Why are you going to necessitate the Israelites to remain in Egypt for another year and experience the makot, that they will be terrorized by the makot? Right. So here you have, this is not something we generally think about. When you're reading Aseret HaMakot, you're reading what's happening to Egypt, right? And what's happening to Paro, and Paro pleading to Moshe and then going back, right? That's what's going on. But where are Bnei Yisrael when this is happening? I don't mean where are they physically. What are they thinking and what are they feeling when they're seeing Eser Makot? Because first of all, they're not reading the story the way we read the story, that we already know the end. They're in the story, and nobody's telling them what's going on, right? So they just see plagues and all sorts of pestilence all around them. So why should they think that they're immune from those things, right? So Bnei Yisrael are terrorized by the Makot, because they're in some sense, at least psychologically, included in Mitzrayim, because they live in Mitzrayim, and we'll see that they're connected to Mitzrayim. What?
They live in Goshen.
Well, the Makot, well, there were Avadim all over, right? So So they're witnessing the makot, and they're terrorized by the makot.
But the makot weren't, they weren't being hit by the makot.
First, they didn't know. If you're walking and a meteorite strikes the person next to you, you don't think you might go into shock, right? Oh, it didn't hit me, right? So literally, like there were meteorites, whether it's barad, right? So they don't know that. Like it's not as if we're saying, okay, this is the plan, Bnei Yisrael. We're going to tell you what's going to happen. They're going to be Eser Makot. Brace yourselves, but don't worry, it's not aimed at you, right? That's not what happened. In the story, people are living in the story, and nobody is telling them what's happening. Okay, so he's saying this is how Bnei Yisrael are experiencing the Makot. Kamoshe Katuv, and the proof of this is what it says in Sefer Dvarim. When Moshe Rabbeinu tells the story, you can learn a lot about the story from Sefer Dvarim, because Moshe Rabbeinu tells the people, the new generation, what happened. So you're getting Moshe Rabbeinu's take on what happened. And he says, Asher Yagorta Mipneihem, right? And you were terrorized by what was going on. Okay? Ki be'emet Yaru Gam Yisrael me'amakot. Because the truth is, the Bnei Yisrael were also terrorized by the makot. V'lachein sha'al zot me'akadosh baruch hu. And that's why that's what Moshe Rabbeinu asked from God. Lama hareyoto lama zeh, not just that there's an additional avodah kasha, now they're going to have to work harder because I antagonized Paro, right? But there's more than that. But now you're going to bring all these terrible things upon the Egyptians, and Bnei Israel are in Egypt, and they're going to be terrorized by this, right? Even if they don't die. Right. First of all, according to Chazal, many did die, right? But even putting that midrash aside, because you don't have to meld midrashim together to make one story, right? So just stick to this narrative, let's say, right? So they're going to be terrorized by this. Why should you put them through this? Take them out, right? V'her'alo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and God showed him, ki gam bazeh yesh tzorech liYisrael. Oh, this is really interesting. We think that the makot are about punishing the Egyptians, right? The truth is, the Egyptians in the story, this has to do with like how you interpret the story, right? There's always empirical data that happens, right? But what makes the story is how we string the data together, what meaning we give. Yeah? Are you with me? Right, so a lot of things happened in Egypt at that time. Things were going on. But they're not part of the story because they're not relevant for us. Because we see the certain things that happen, the things that are part of our universe. And we construct our universe by taking those things and stringing them together and creating a story out of it and then giving the story meaning. Right? Yeah? I don't know if you're used to thinking about it this way, but this is what's going on. So why do I have to know about the makot that Mitzrayim got? Why isn't it just sufficient to say, right, that Mitzrayim suffered makot and they gave up in the end, and then Bnei Israel were released from Egypt? So why do we have to know about the makot? What this makkah and this makkah and this makkah, right? Yeah.
It doesn't specifically say that God does this because he wants the world to see the greatness, his greatness, not to punish the Egyptians necessarily, since the Egyptians didn't really, the people who were being punished didn't really have a say. It's all Paro.
So we'll talk about that. So the thing is, so we don't really care about the Egyptians per se, right? What we care about, the Egyptians in the sense, in the story, the Egyptians are styrofoam. Right? They're just packaging. What we care about is not only the rest of the world. He's not going in that direction, but I hear what you're saying. What we care about is Bnei Yisrael. So God communicates to Moshe that Bnei Yisrael are in need of the makot. Actually, this idea that they should suffer the terror of the makot is something that they need, which is why it's part, which I'm adding, that's why it's part of the story, so that we can experience the makot. Okay, let's see why should that be, right? Ki gam bazeh yesh tzorech liYisrael. There's a need for Israel. Ki be'emet hayalem liYisrael eze shayachut im Mitzrayim. because the Jews, I'm going to translate shayachut means relationship, but what it means here is like some sort of enmeshment. That Bnei Yisrael were enmeshed in Mitzrayim. Kamo shekatuv, as it says, lakachat lo goy mikerev goy. Hainu keubar hanishmat mibeten imo. Sheyesh lo sheyachut im imo. Right, so getting Bnei Yisrael out of Egypt is like birthing an animal, right? It's like birth. So you don't usually think about it this way. Let's broaden the picture a little bit. Bnei Yisrael come down to Egypt for life because there's a famine, right? And Egypt takes them in and nourishes them. So in a certain sense, Egypt is like our mother, right? She gave us nourishment, right? Now, but then she doesn't want to let us go, right? Now, the birthing image is actually very important. This is I'm going to say as an aside, right? When you talk about extracting Bnei Yisrael from Mitzrayim, the way you would extract an embryo from the womb of the mother, right? What imagery would you expect? There would be blood on the petach, and there would be water which breaks, and there'd be human beings coming out. Isn't that what happens? Right? What do you think the dam on the petach is of the Korban Pesach? It's blood. It's blood on the passageway. It's a birthing scene. And then the people come to the water, and the water has to break for the people to emerge. Right? So that's birth. Right? That's what Chazal are looking at when they say lakach. I mean, that's a pasuk. Lakachat lo goy mikerev goy is to take one nation from the midst of another nation. Right? So Mitzrayim is like let's say, some primordial mother, right? That against its will is giving birth to the people. Okay? Now that, as an aside to the aside, right? That's the ancient Mesopotamian creation myth. Right, that Tiamat doesn't want to let the world be created, and Marduk comes and tears Tiamat open, and the amniotic fluid becomes the sea, and her body becomes Mother Earth. Right, so that's what you have in Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim Metzar Yam, right? Mitzrayim Metzar Yam, the narrow passage of the sea, right, is the birth canal, right? And Mitzrayim does not want, because it wants to hold the life onto itself. Think of it this way. The Soviet Union didn't want to let the Jews go because the Jews were a bracha. So they wanted to hold on to them, right? So think of it in mythical terms, right? So Bnei Israel don't want to let the life out, right? So there's this myth of the mother, right? We all have Jewish mothers, right? And some of us are Jewish mothers, I assume. Right? But there's this myth of the mother doesn't want to let the child go, right? And it's smothering, right? So that's Mitzrayim. And sometimes they have to break away, right? So that's what's being described here. Lakachat lo goy mikerev goy, hainu keubar hanishmat mimei imo, sheyesh lo shayachut im imo. Right. So there's an enmeshment that the child has with its mother. V'lachein. So how do we but there has to be a healthy separation. Okay. V'lachein hutzurchu gam heim. And that's why Bnei Israel had to experience the terror of the Makot. Because what that does, right, is it separates, that trauma actually, separates them from the Egyptians. Okay? And that fear purified their hearts. Right, the reason that there's lightning and thunder is kidei lifshot akmimiyut shibalev. Right, in order to, like, there's no atheists in the foxhole. Mm-hmm. Right, so the fear, right, is something, it can be edifying. Right, so Bnei Yisrael have to go through that. So the makot, again, Egypt is styrofoam. What we care about in the story is our story. It's the story of Bnei Yisrael. So the makot are really for us. Right? And the Egyptians just have to suffer them so that we should witness it. Right? Now, the Magia Lahem, but that's not the point for us. Okay? I just want to support this, the Mashloch's thesis, by just showing you very, very briefly how the theme of the Makot is to separate the Jews from Egypt. Okay? Vayavo bein, these are psukim that I collected, right? Bein machane Mitzrayim ubein machane Yisrael, right? You have the Anan, the Eish and the Anan, and the emphasis is that there's an Eish and an Anan separating the Jews and the Egyptians. Then on the Makav Arov, the next source that I have, right? V'fleiti bayomahu et eretz Goshen, asher ami omed aleha, leviltia yot sham arov, leman teda ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz, v'samti fidut bein ami uvein amecha, lemachar ye'ot hazeh. The purpose of arov, right, is to draw a distinction between the Egyptians and the Jews. Well, think of it this way: when Moshe ran away to Midian, did they say Ish Ivri? They didn't say Ish Ivri. They said Ish Mitzri. He looked Egyptian. The Jews, this is against certain midrashim, but the Jews were assimilated into Egypt as slaves, but they were assimilated into Egypt, and they had to be separated from Egypt. Not only separated physically, or not even primarily physically, but they had to become separated existentially, and they had to reclaim their ancient identity, right? And that is through the Makot. The next one.
But isn't that pasuk is directed toward Paro?
Right, but he's telling Paro, I'm going to make a distinction between my people and your people.
Yeah, but for Paro's edification, not for the edification of the Jewish people.
Paro still plays. Yeah, but Paro. See, it's interesting because Paro still plays a role. This is guess something else. Paro plays a role because by Kriyat Yamsuf, the last thing that happens before God tells Moshe Netete et Chalayam and let the waters overcome the Egyptians, is Paro says, what does it say? Hashem HaTzadik, Hashem HaTzadik, Anusa mipnei Yisrael, ki Hashem nilcham lahem b'Mitzrayim. Right? The last thing the Paro does is he admits that it was God fighting for them. And then once that happens, that's what Bnei Yisrael had to hear. Because it has to be being let go. Right? They have to be let go. So Paro is important, but he's important for us. Right? Because Paro is like the mother, right? You can be like the most successful, you can be president of the United States, but if your mother thinks you're a failure, you always feel that you're a failure. So Paro, I don't know about Trump's mother, whatever, but who knows, right? That I'm out of my depth trying to psychoanalyze Trump. But so we need him for the story, okay? Very similar to the way we need Lavan in the story, but that's a whole separate share, okay? So you have it again. V'fla Hashem bein meknei Yisrael ubein meknei Mitzrayim v'lo yamut mikol bnei Yisrael davar. Right, next. Rak be'eretz Goshen asher Hashem bnei Yisrael lo haya habarad. Next. U'lechol bnei Yisrael haya or be'moshvotam. Right? L'man teidun asher yafle Hashem bein Mitzrayim ubein Yisrael. So there's a theme of the Makot is actually to draw, this is 5 out of the 10 Makot, right? That there's a theme to draw a distinction between Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim, because Bnei Yisrael have to reclaim their ancient identity, and that's going to happen through tsaros, right? Through primarily the tsaros of the Mitzrayim, but we don't know that, right? So God is having rachamim on us, right? But so we don't know that, but we experience when the meteorites come down and they barely miss us, right? So that makes you feel like, okay, so like why me? Why them and not me? So you begin to experience the distinction, okay? So what he's describing here is this emotional enmeshment that Bnei Israel have with Mitzrayim. It could be that they need to free themselves from. You know, what he's talking about, or the picture that he's painting, is that the becoming free from Egypt is, even though we're used to thinking of it as this thing that happens on the stage of history and it's political, so to speak. In other words, there's peoples who are enslaved here and then they become free and they go from one place to another place. Like that's happening on the stage of history. But the real drama is happening inside. And the stage of history is a projection, let's say, of what's happening inside. And what's happening inside is that the people internally are part of Egypt, and they have to be separated from Egypt, right? That's why, and if you pay attention to the Haggadah, right? Ilu lo hotzenu mitzrayim hayinu anu vanenu vnei banenu mishuabidim hayinu b'paro b'mitzrayim. What does it mean? Paro in Mitzrayim is dead for a long time. They didn't even find his mummy, right? So he's dead for a long time. So what do you mean? Even today we would be prisoners of Egypt. It means that we would still be subjugated in our minds and our hearts to Egypt. Right? Okay, so let's take a look at another source, actually, which is the source that I gave out. Oh, but I didn't save myself one. Can I have one? Okay. All right, so this is also the Mashilach. This is extremely important. This is a Mashilach in the beginning of Parshat B'Shalach. Okay, you don't, there aren't enough to go around? Okay, I'll read it slowly and I'll translate it. Okay? Vayhi B'Shalach Paro, when Paro sent the people out. Dihine. Now, he's describing here Moshe Rabbeinu's state of mind at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Again, this is in contrast to Charlton Heston. Okay? Dihine, Olav Shalom, I think, right? He died this year. Right? Hine, Ka'asher Ra'ah Moshe Rabbeinu Alav Shalom, when Moshe saw, Ki af akar sheyigalu, even after the people were redeemed from Egypt, Od Paro holech achareihem lelavotam, right? He saw that Paro was chasing them, and that was not expected, right? They're leaving Egypt, so they should be leaving, but Paro is chasing them with his army. Now, what is Moshe Rabbeinu's response to that? Allah b'da'ato safek. An uncertainty arose in his mind. Right? That's really interesting. You picture that's why I emphasize Charlton Heston, right? Because Charlton Heston is a 6'4" guy, right? He doesn't suffer, he's a wasp from stomach, right? He doesn't suffer self-doubt and anxiety, right? But Moshe Rabbeinu was Jewish, right? So they're leaving Mitzrayim, and you feel like what moment is more clear than Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? Be'etzem hayom hazeh hotzi Hashem, right? Be'etzem hayom hazeh, clear as day. And Moshe Rabbeinu, Allah b'da'ato safek. Moshe Rabbeinu all of a sudden is not sure, right? He's not sure. What is he not sure about? Pen adayin lo nishlemu Yisrael betachlit hashlemut. Maybe the people aren't ready, right? Va'ayidei zeh yesh od shayachut leparo imahem, and that's why Paro has some sort of hold over them. Because the assumption that he's making is that there's a parallel between the interior reality of the people and, let's call it, the historical stage. That if Paro is succeeding to pursue Bnei Yisrael out in the desert, that means that Bnei Yisrael internally are still subjugated to him. Paro wouldn't have the power to pursue them if they themselves were still not bound up with him. Right? That's the assumption, that there are parallel realities, so to speak. Okay? And one reality reflects the other reality. Okay? So maybe the people aren't ready. Upenu machmat, and why would they not be ready? Upenu machmat shahayu zman rav b'Mitzrayim. Lachein yesh lo tzad shayachut imahem. And maybe it's because the Jews spent so much time in Egypt that they were now already enmeshed in Egypt. Yeah?
But this doesn't explain why Moshe had doubts.
Moshe had doubts about the people. That maybe, this is really interesting. Just hold on one second. I want to talk. This is really important. The Gam, so that's one thing. He looks at the people and he says the people have been in Egypt for a very long time. They're basically assimilated into Egypt. And maybe that you can't, God, in a certain sense, God can't do miracles. In the sense that he can't change the internal state of the people. If the people are enmeshed in Mitzrayim, then he can't take them out, right? That's why it takes 12 months because God has to wean them from Egypt. Why couldn't he just do that, right? And save all the psychotherapy bills, right? No, because he had to wean them in a natural way, right, from identifying as Egyptians. Okay, just give me a second. Let me just, right? And then furthermore, right, and all this is in Moshe Rabbeinu's mind when he says, maybe I got it wrong. That tells a lot about the nature of revelation. It's not like God said this and Moshe heard the words. It has to do with Moshe Rabbeinu's intuitions and how he interprets some sort of feeling of something that's coming from God, right? And maybe he got it wrong. Furthermore, he had more reason to doubt. The gam mira'oto ki lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim pen yinachem ha'am. And he also saw that they weren't going the right way. They were going he didn't take them derech eretz plishtim, right? He took them into the desert. And why? Why didn't he take them through Eretz Plishtim? Pen Yeru Milchama v'Shav Mitzrayim. The people are going to want to go back to Egypt. So they're still enmeshed in Egypt. So God can't take them. For some reason, we're going the wrong way. So Moshe Rabbeinu is looking at the people. The people look like they're a bunch of Egyptians slaves, but they're Egyptians, right? And we're going the wrong way. And again, we always read the story with the benefit of knowing the end, right? Just remember, read the story as if it's happening the first time, right? And you don't know the end. And Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't understand what's happening, right? Mizehevin ki od lo nishlamu betachlit haberur. And from this he understood the people aren't ready. The people are not ready. So he has a mistake. Now, this is, I'll say also, I'll bracket this, right? This has to do with what level of certainty do you read current events? Okay? In other words, people think they understand what God wants, right? They read the newspaper and they find the pasuk that explains what happened yesterday, right? And you see a lot on Facebook, especially yesterday, right? But so a little bit of humility, right, is required. That if Moshe Rabbeinu in the beginning of Geulat, in the middle of Geulat Mitzrayim, is suddenly thinking, maybe I got it wrong, Allah b'da'ato safek, that he's uncertain about the readiness of the people, so that should give everyone pause. Okay? And the reason for that is that there's some sort of, again, enmeshment that the people have with Egypt. Now it's natural. Like think of the Stockholm syndrome. Everybody remember what that is?
Yes.
Right? Remember, what was her name? Patty Duke? Patty Hearst. No, Patty Duke was the actress. Right? Right? Okay. They looked alike though. But Patty Hearst, like they found, she was abducted, when was it, 1970s? I don't remember when. I was a kid, but she was abducted and then they found on security tapes that she was with them, with the Symbionese Liberation Army, right? Yeah. They were robbing. She robbed banks together with them. So there's this psychological phenomena where the captor, as a defense mechanism, identifies with the captive identifies with the captor, right? Makes him feel safe, right? So there's that going on, right? So Bnei Israel, they hate the Egyptians, but they want to be just like them, right? That's why the first mitzvah after Yetziat Mitzrayim has to be about slaves and protecting slaves, because there's a danger that after being a slave, you would actually want to assert yourself and have slaves, right? So there has to be a response to that, because you definitely want to be like the Egyptians. The Egyptians are great. I want to be just like them, right? So you have this enmeshment. Let's take a look at something else here. And this has to do with Sfirat HaOmer for a moment. Sfirat HaOmer is what happens right after Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? So take a look on the source here. Sfartam lechem mocharat haShabbat.
Which one?
In the middle of the first side, yeah? Right? Usfartem lachem, where it says Mea Shiloach Parshas Emor.
Okay.
Usfartem lachem mimocharat haShabbat. Inyan Sfira, what's Sfirat HaOmer about? Hu biyan ki zeh hazman מפסח עד שבועות, צריך שמירה. It's a dangerous time between Pesach and Shavuot. You need protection. Why do we need protection? כמו שכתוב, שבועות חוקות קציר ישמרו לנו. Agriculturally, it's a dangerous time. The grain is still in the field, you haven't collected it yet, and you're vulnerable to rain. So it's a precarious time between Pesach and Shavuot, agriculturally, right? ישמור לנו מרוחות רעות ומתעללים רעים. לכן ציווה לנו השם יתברך, that's why we have a mitzvah, לספור ולצפות מיום ליום, עד זמן מתן תורתנו, ונהיה שומרי מצווה. שומר מצווה לא ידע דבר רע. Okay, so as he's saying, that's why we have to count every day. Because you're doing a mitzvah every day. But what is that about? You can't just let the time pass without any awareness. It's a hazardous time, so you have to tread carefully and pay attention every moment. And that's what Sfirat HaOmer is about. Okay? Now, one of the way that the hazardous nature of that time expresses itself is in the agricultural year. Right? But in the desert, it wasn't because of the agricultural year. Think about the hazardous time between Yetziat Mitzrayim and Matan Torah. Right? And this also has to do with being enmeshed in Egypt and the dangers, right, of freedom, actually, political freedom, right? They're free of the Egyptian taskmasters, but there's no law yet. There's no Ma'amad Har Sinai. So what happens when you have people that are politically free, but there's no law? That's really dangerous, right? So that's where Bnei Yisrael are. They're out of Mitzrayim, but there's no law to what did John Adams say? The people are in need of strong governance. There's a whole question of how strong the federal government should be, right? So in the beginning, right? So the people are in need of strong governance, right? There have to be institutions and laws that set limits on human passions and desires. So freedom could be something really dangerous if it's not met with law. And that's where and that's a really important thing today also to realize, right? That it's not just about political freedom and what most of the people want, right? It's also about having objective or near objective principles that govern society. And without that, society is in peril. So that's actually where Sfirat HaOmer is, right? So there's a process, right? Becoming free is not something that happens like that, right? There's an enmeshment in Mitzrayim. There's identity with Mitzrayim, right? Literally, they can feel themselves as Egyptians, right? Moshe Rabbeinu looked like an Egyptian, right? And they have to acquire their own identity, and they also have to be able to learn to govern themselves. Okay. I want to share now we have just a few more minutes, but a Sfat Emet. Yeah, a question?
Yeah. Before seeing Paro, Moshe knew that Paro would be coming because God wanted that Paro was coming after you.
Yeah. Right.
So why was he surprised?
There's a difference between seeing it and just, right? When you see it and you see the whole army, right? It's like why does God want Paro to chase after? That also has to do.
He told him why. He cut out the Paro.
Right. Okay, but because that had to do with the need for the separation of the Jews from Paro. That if you run out, that's actually a good point. If you run out Ki'ilu literally in the middle of the night, right? Vahiba Chatzi Alayla, right? You run in the middle of the night, you'll always have Paro chasing you. Right? In your mind, you'll always have Paro chasing you. So that's why they have to bring Paro. You know who talks about this? The Chidush Yaran. In the Middle Ages, some Rishon actually spoke about this. That they had to bring Paro to the Yam, and we had to see Paro admit that Hashem nilcham lana b'Mitzrayim. I mean, that freed us psychologically, right? So that's the purpose of all that. It's all around the enmeshment, right? Okay, and it's Okay, let's just take it. Let's accept that for it. I want to take a look at the Sfat Emet. Here, the next to last source. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yashuvu. La'asher, right? See that bnei Yisrael. This has to do with bnei Yisrael. This actually is the part that you referenced. God tells Moshe to tell bnei Yisrael to go back because we want to lure the Egyptians out, right? So we're not going to go straight. We have to make sure the Egyptians are following us, right? That's in terms of the pshat. So he talks about this. What is this that bnei Yisrael have to go back? We just escaped from Egypt, and then God tells Moshe, tell them to go back. Okay? Daber bnei Yisrael v'yashuvu. So now listen this is the Sfat Emet. La'asher yatz'u bnei Yisrael b'chipazon miMitzrayim v'haya shelo b'hadraga. Right? We know the bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim in haste. Right? And it wasn't a slow process. In other words, there was a process before. But when it happened very fast, right? Things like take a long time, and think of the collapse of Syria. It took a very long time, right? So many people were killed, and it took, how long did the war go on? 10 years, right? And then when it happened b'chipazon, right? So it took a long time, but it happened b'chipazon. So people couldn't absorb the magnitude of what happened, right? So he says, "La'asher yatzu bnei Yisrael b'chipazon miMitzrayim, v'haya shelo b'hadraga." It wasn't a gradual process. Ve'ein ze davar shel kayama. They couldn't absorb it. It didn't sit with them. It happened so fast, they didn't absorb the fact that they were free. They couldn't. It was too much, right? Hutzruchu lashuv. They had to go back. Because they, in a sense, Moshe is saying, or God is telling Moshe, they left in too much of a hurry. Because they can't absorb what happened to them. So they have to go back and dwell in that place of together with Egypt in order to leave in a way which we could digest that we were free. Right? This all has to do with how can the birth happen? Yeah.
But it also may have been an enticement for the Egyptians. Say, look, they're lost in the desert, they're turning back.
Right, but that's the pshat in the story. But I'm reading how the Sfas Emes is reading it, that beyond that God is sort of acting as a therapist, that this was too traumatic, you couldn't absorb it, because it's too much of a monumental event, right? So they have to slow down. Sometimes people who get involved in something, you have to tell them, slow down, because you're oblivious to what's going on, and it's not going to be good for you later. You had a question?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but in America, in the States, the Negroes that they were called then, were basically close to being slaves.
They were what? They were slaves.
They were slaves.
Right.
First of all, they were slaves.
Right.
And then they were given in the 60s. They were given more freedom. Possible. Right. But they weren't able to then get out of that situation because they didn't have that. Martin Luther King, he had influence. He was a great person, but since then there hasn't really been someone that would help them get out of that slavery.
Look, we're not going to get to the history of blacks in America,
but it's becoming because there is something.
It was supposed to happen in the 1870s with Reconstruction, and then it was rolled back in the South, and they didn't push it forward. It would have happened 100 years earlier, and America wouldn't be suffering now from all this.
Afterwards.
Okay, so I think it's too big of a parsha to get into now. Let's continue here with the Sfat Emet. So there's too much happening. Yeah. The Ein Shel Kayama Hutzruchu Lashuv. That's why they had to go back. V'inyan kamo shekatuv. V'hachayot ratzo v'shov. This is from Masa Merkava, but what he's saying here is that human experience, chiyut, the life of human beings, goes back and forth. It's not that there's this, the modernist view of things, is there's this march forward, right? And we're always progressing, right? That's the myth of evolution, right? Do you understand? I'm not talking about the biological story of evolution. I'm talking about the myth of evolution, that human society marches forward. Progress. Progress is also a myth, right? So what he's saying is that that's not what it's like. That's what it is. There's always a backwards and a forward. So they gain freedom, but they're still enmeshed, and they can't absorb it, so they have to go back. That's the Ratzo Vashov. Okay? Vayidei zeh yesh kiyum. And through that back and forward motion, then they can absorb it. Okay? And he says this is the purpose of Galuyot. Right? All right, that's a separate thing. The positive nature of Galut. This is not Zionistic. Right? That there's a positive, it's important to realize that there are other ways of looking at history. Right? That Galut has a positive role in constituting Jewish identity and, let's say, emotional health, right? Where you can sit and absorb things. Right? It's not just black and white and you're always moving forward. There's a backwards and forwards which is necessary for healthy development. Right? That's what the Sfat Emet is describing here. I'd like to go back to what I opened with, right? The question of what Yad Ramah means, right? In light of this, right? B'nai Yisrael yotzim b'Yad Ramah. It either means a hand held high or the head held high. What's the difference? So now let's take a look at the Meshilach on top, the fourth source from the top. Okay? B'nai Yisrael yotzim b'Yad Ramah. Everybody with me? Okay? Targumo, right? The Targum says, Beresh Gale, right? With a head held high. Hainu. Now he's analyzing this. Lo biyad Ramah neged acherim, bega'ava v'geut, rak shehem b'nei chorim, b'li yir'av afachad mishum adam. I want to read that again. This has to do with how we take our freedom. Okay? Ubnei Yisrael yotzim biyad Ramah, Targumo, Beresh Galei. What does Beresh Galei mean? Lo biyad Ramah, not with a hand held high, neged acherim. Right? He understands the hand held high, right? Mitgabrim al Mitzray. It's as if we left Egypt and we were facing back towards the Egyptians and say, you know, we showed you, right? So he said that's not what the head held high means. The freedom that the Meshach was talking about is freedom which is not reactive to others, right? It's not reactive to the oppressor, right? He says, Lo biyad Ramah neged acherim bega'ava v'geut. The freedom is not characterized by pride, right, and a desire for power. Rak shehem b'nei chorim, only that they're free. B'li yir'ava fachad mishum adam. They're free. Their freedom does not have to be targeted against others. If I target my freedom against others, I'm never really free. I'm just responding, even though my oppressor may be dead, may be long dead, I would be responding to them and not be free. I didn't give myself the space, right? Because that's what Sfat Emet is talking about. That if it happens too quickly, you haven't given yourself the space to step into your freedom. To what is it to be free? Who am I? Not like I am not. I'm not the Nazis, and I'm not the Christians, and I'm not the Muslims, right? But good, okay. But who am I? Right? So the freedom is not against others, right? But that would be reenacting the trauma. That would be traumatized by what happened, and having that trauma chase you forever. Hayinu avadim leparo b'Mitzrayim ad hayom hazeh. Right? So be very careful with the past experiences, right? And how we become freed of those experiences. It's a process, right? And that process is what the Sfat Emet describes, that it seems to happen quickly, but then you have to go back and give it its space so that you can come into your own identity. Your identity is characterized not by your response to others or your response to your oppressors, right? But by who you are in a positive way, right? That's what the head held high means, right? So we have to be very, very careful when, and there's a natural tendency, right, to identify, let's say, things that happen today with things that happened before, right? The Hamas are Nazis, right? Well, Hamas are really bad, and you can be really, really, really bad and still not be a Nazi, right? The Nazis were one kettle of fish, right? And Hamas is a different kettle of fish, right? And the Iranians are a different kettle of fish, and Putin is different. Every situation is different, right? And if you evoke the wrong experience, right, it re-traumatizes, right? So somebody said to me, somebody who lost someone in the war, said, "Where were we when they were building Auschwitz in Gaza?" So I didn't say anything to them because they were hurting, but you know, I visited Auschwitz about 6 months ago. Auschwitz was October 7th every 20 minutes. Okay, so just to put that in perspective, and then we were helpless against a modern technological state. Today, it's just a totally different situation. But when you re-traumatize the people, because those traumas exist, when you re-traumatize the people, it totally blurs your experience of the present. Then you don't even know what's going on now. You're not responding to the situation today. You're responding to the Nazis. Like if I had a nuclear bomb, I wouldn't bomb Berlin in 1942. From the stomach, I would have, right? But it's not the same thing. It's just a totally different situation, right? So when people come, some of them do it unwittingly, and some of them do it in a calculated way in order to stay in power. So that they re-traumatize the people so they can keep them on edge. And that's taking away their freedom, right? The freedom that we have is to be b'cherut, b'li pachad mishum adam, right? In other words, who am I? What is the situation? Not like it was a traumatic situation is when you re-experience your trauma. But that's not what's happening, right? But the person gets thrown back, right? And that's the danger of Bnei Yisrael coming out of Mitzrayim, right? So what the Meir Shloka is saying, no, you have to define your freedom for yourself, and not in response to Mitzrayim, right? And today, in the state of Israel, we have to define our freedom for ourselves, not in response to other things. We have enough real life challenges that we have to face without being traumatized, either unintentionally or intentionally, by what happened before, so that our responses can be appropriate to the unique situations that we're always facing. Right? I think that's what we have to understand, that Yetziat Mitzrayim was complicated, right? Because people are complicated, and these processes are complicated. It's not like you're an Eved and you become free, right? It's much more that there's something that happened to you psychologically. You were traumatized. You have to be freed from that. There are things that happen quickly that you don't have time to absorb, and then you have to go back and absorb them, and you have to make sure that you're not reactive. Right? This is what the freedom is about. Okay? Yeah, Marla.
The Shoah was this generation, Yetziat Mitzrayim,
so to speak. Yeah.
But what I realized with my generation, being second generation, too many Jews did not leave that with their head held high. And that trauma followed and became so much of Jewish education in America, for example. I mean, it was Holocaust Judaism. The answer when we would ask in Sunday school, why be Jewish? Why is it important? Because of the Holocaust. Not because
they wanted to kill me.
Not because of Judaism's great, Torah's amazing, blah, blah, blah. We never understood the positive, the real reason for being our Yiddishkeit was so tainted by that.
Right.
So you can really appreciate the critical nature of finding your own identity, being free from that trauma, and not identifying yourselves under that trauma.
Right, but at the same time, we have to make sure that our Zionism is not a function of that trauma as well, where power becomes the answer to power all the time. Right? Just be careful. Just be careful all the situations
Right. Or
yeah.
identifying Israel as the safe haven. Like that's how we learned about why Israel's important because of, right? And
That might be true.
No, but it should. I think it needs its own definition of
Yeah.
why it's important, other than as a safe haven.
Right. Okay.
Because the others still like we're being chased.
Right. Okay. All right. One more question. I think I'm up. That the time is.
One more?
Yeah.
Two more?
All right. Two more. Okay. Go ahead.
We started asking why the 10 makot,
Yeah.
the need for the 10 makot.
Yeah.
And he said it was because we had to learn.
Yeah.
We did not. The Khartoumim said, "Ze etzba Hashem."
Right.
The only one who understood was Nachshon.
Okay. I'm not going to do the whole Okay. There's all this parshanut that can be made. But okay. Fine. It should be a question. Yeah.
So it's a really interesting idea you have in terms of casting the whole process of therapy. But I would say it's failed therapy. And,
Let's say ongoing.
What?
Let's call it ongoing.
No, I call it failed therapy.
Okay.
When they went out to, when they actually left, they all said, we remember Egypt so fondly.
Right. Of course, you see that the draw is still there. Yes, of course.
So I think that
Not
God
totally
realizes
successful.
when he says we have to get rid of this generation that the therapy did not work, and what we actually have to do is physically change the people who are involved.
I understand. Yeah, but it's an ongoing
How
therapy.
many actually said
I always say that God owes B'nai Israel therapy, and he has to pay the bill. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. What?
Do you still teach in Chopin?
I do in here.